if there's one thing that doesn't get nearly enough credit as it should for affecting the Second World War, it's not have to be the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty. And this is important because after the First World War, the war to end all war, the Great War, this massive clusterfuck of trench warfare, the leftover major powers, the great powers, which were Britain, France, Italy, Japan, and the US, were in the middle of an arms race because of the naval revolution that was caused by the Dreadnought and the lessons learned by the Battle of Jutland. They thought, hey, we should build these new ships and these new fleets to top into like from lessons learned about the First World War. And so they start to build up their navies. But the problem is, since navies were determined by the number and the power of their battleships, and battleships are expensive as all shit, they realized that if they kept building up, they would go bankrupt, and the surplus would just go straight to fucking hell, and they would lose all their money. And it didn't help that they had just fought a massive war, for 4 years. And so they got together in Washington and said, hey, let's have a holiday of 10 years where we don't build anything, or any major capital ships, so we can not go bankrupt. Going in, the Japanese delegation wanted to have a 10 to 10 to 7 ratio of allowed battleships between the US, the UK, and Japan. What they got was 5 to 5 to 3, which is 10 to 10 to 6, or just a bit less than what they wanted. Now the thing is, even though by treaty they were limited to 60% of what the US or the UK could have, in reality that was still a lot better than what they could have been if they hadn't signed a treaty at all, because, I mean, come on. Japan, this mountainous-ass island country, fucking Korea doesn't count, Taiwan doesn't count, because that was, 1922 was 12 years after Korea had been annexed. That's not enough time to set up any significant sort of naval shipyards. Mountainous-ass country the size of Montana does not produce 60% the industrial power of the US, or Britain for that matter. And so if the construction of new ships hadn't been checked by the treaty, Japan would have been completely fucking outnumbered by just the fucking tidal wave of US and British industrial power. Case in point was the Second World War, the Casablanca-class escort carrier, built by the US in the mid to late Pacific War. Now, yeah, they were pretty shitty carriers overall. They had destroyer-tier machinery, and they can only carry 30 or 28 planes apiece. But still, 50 carriers is a lot of carriers. In that same time, Japan built like half a dozen comparable carriers, and half of them, most of them really, were either converted from ocean liners or like cruise ships, like civilian ships, or they were converted from seaplane tenders, instead of being built up from scratch, which the Casablanca class was. And perhaps the most important aspect of the treaty was the carrier clause, which said that if the signatory countries had a couple of battleships that were being constructed when the treaty was signed, they could be as to not waste the manpower that went into it. They could convert them into carriers like midway through the process, and that's what Japan did with Akagi and Kaga, which you may notice have the same names as two of the ships in the Kidobutai, the carrier fleet that attacked Pearl Harbor. Surprise, surprise, it's because they are the same ships. And because nations were forced to convert their battleships into carriers, this meant that they would focus a lot more on carrier doctrine, carrier technology, carrier plane technology especially, and this means that if the treaty had not been signed, a lot of things that were dependent on the advance of carrier technology to have existed would not exist. The Zero? Nope. The Wildcat? Nope. Akagi? Nope. Kaga? Nope. The Akagi would have been built as planned as a Amagi-class battlecruiser, and Kaga would have been built again as planned as a Tosa-class battleship. And so they would have been built as part of the H-8 fleet and not as part of the carrier fleet. And the Pearl Harbor attack, definitely not with the 1930s level of technology. And instead you would see things like the ferry Swordfish in frontline service in the 1940s because without the need to make their carriers useful, they wouldn't have focused so much on improving carrier planes, improving carrier doctrines, and they would have instead spent their time and effort building up their battleship fleets. And so you probably would have seen a lot more battleship-to-battleship action during the Second World War. Like, yeah, like, you know, Denmark Strait, Guadalcanal, they existed, but they weren't nearly as widespread as they would have been if most of a navy was still built around the battleships. One more less important, I guess, or less major clause was you could only build heavy cruisers up to 10,000 tons, and they couldn't have guns above 8 inches or 200 millimeters, which is why almost uniformly all heavy cruisers that were in frontline service during the Second World War had 8-inch guns. Now, of course, some countries did try to abide by the rules and only build treaty cruisers. But of course, you got things like the Tatar class, which were built as treaty cruisers, but they weren't. They were overweight by like 4,000 tons, which is a lot actually. That's like 40%, and they were not very good ships because they were, since they were built to the confines of the 10,000 ton limit. They were built with adequate armor and adequate guns, but the welding was off, and they were really top heavy because they were trying to fit a bunch of guns into a small hull, and so that meant that most of them weren't seaworthy, and they had to be rebuilt after they were tested and found to be completely fucking defective and almost useless as ships, because they were warships and they could war pretty well, but they couldn't ship for fun, and it just didn't work out. And so, if the treaty hadn't taken place, you might have seen designs with 10-inch guns, or even maybe even 12-inch guns on heavy cruisers. And of course, battleship guns no longer limited to 16-inch or 406 millimeter. They might have gotten bigger. Maybe 18-inch guns would have been uniform or common on battleships if the treaty hadn't fucking wrecked battleship building plans for the next decade and a half. But yeah, I think we should all recognize the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 for shaping the battlefield of the Second World War the way it did. Because if you watch 100 entry-level documentaries on the Second World War, maybe 5 of them, will even mention the treaty, and like maybe one, maybe not, will go into any level of detail about the treaty and its clauses, and most importantly, its effects. Because to understand how the Second World War was fought and lost, you gotta know how its equipment was made. And to know that, you gotta know how the designers were, limited or helped in certain ways. Because you can't have art without adversity. But yeah, that's all I have to say on the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you guys later. Bye.